Thanks, Yanni. I was glad you didn't talk about my complete unpreparedness for the weather when we first met, because you guys gave me so much grief for how badly I thought I understood cold weather. I had this ridiculous jacket that had no quilting, and you and Susanna were like, get you to the department store immediately. So now I understand the importance of quilting, among other things, in stylish female jackets. I just thought I'd take a moment while I can to remind everybody that almost 5 years ago, a number of us gathered here today were upstairs at Glee Books, a Sydney intellectual institution, to hear Catherine Gibson launch the Affect Theory Reader. And I hadn't heard Catherine's name through the conference so far, and I just wanted to pay respect to her and Julie, who were important influences for us in putting the book together, and unfortunately couldn't be in the book because of reasons that are probably obvious to some of you that were to do with illness. And then a few months later, we were also very lucky, Gregg and I, to meet with Patricia, who we were all blown away by earlier today, at another iconic bookstore, Blue Stockings. So this was the Northern Hemisphere celebration, and the Lower East Side seemed a fitting environment because so many of our comrades in Affect are hovering around that neighbourhood in one way or another. So I could never have imagined then that sharing drafts and edits and hallway conversations, often at other people's conferences, would lead to this kind of gathering, an overwhelmingly good-looking bunch of people, I might add, an affect theory conference. So I think this is testimony to the infectiousness of my co-editor in embodying the affordances of affect theory and the reciprocity it implies. I'm also really grateful for the people who've come into my life as a result of this book. I warned Jenny that I was going to be emotional, so she needed to be a good chair. But this book stands as a statement of shared investment, and for what I especially want to thank Gregg for saying yes to the impossible. And I'm reminded of Lisa's wonderful introduction to the conference where, she was using Lewis Carroll to say that we should be imagining 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, that's what it looks like to me when I open the Affect Theory Reader. At least 6 impossible things in the table of contents, and then in the plenary speakers for this conference. So that's my little moment of just saying thank you, Gregg. Okay, so I don't have much time. I'm very excited also to have the opportunity to think literally alongside Natasha, who I think has written one of the most important ethnographies of a generation in addiction by design. We were thinking of calling this session Affect by Design, and what's to come follows nicely, I think, from the previous plenary in getting to the material textures of the machine zone and what precisely it is. You all know what that means if you heard Patricia. So in contrast to the dominant industry and academic approaches of what I now understand to be HCI over the last 2.5 years, human-computer interaction, Natasha shows how design, object and subject work together to create interdependencies and attunements that make one or other, actant or participant, hard to differentiate. And this really resonates with my work recently on productivity technologies. When we're talking about productivity tools and productivity apps, which I may do today if I get there, Natasha's past work on gambling has this wonderful lexicon from the ethnographic material where she says, the machine is a reliable mechanism for securing a zone of insulation from a human world that is experienced as capricious, discontinuous, and insecure. The continuity of the machine interface holds worldly contingencies in a kind of abeyance, granting an otherwise elusive zone of certainty. So I think both of our projects can offer, and I'm quoting her again, a window onto the kinds of contingencies and anxieties that riddle contemporary American life. I'm going to show you some anxieties shortly. And the questions I think we're both going to kind of address in this session are whether we enter the zone to escape the human and become machine. I think we're also going to ask in what ways designers become implicated in engineering experience. My current job title is Principal Engineer for User Experience. That's what's changed since 2010. And I think the other thing that we share, Natasha and I, is in the context of labour or leisure, when those distinctions still apply, we are often attached to productivity machines. And these machines, while they may originally present themselves as self-actualising devices for the user, they may actually become ultimately self-extinguishing. Now see if you recognise this line. A relation of cruel optimism exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. What I hope to show you in this talk is that over the past 5 years, one of those somethings may turn out to have been a job. The financial crisis and the rise of contract labour, the so-called gig economy, and the student debt movement have all contributed to the viability of understanding labour as a narrative of optimism wrecked by decline or deterioration. A story that suggests that there are now few guaranteed benefits of employment or indeed secure ongoing jobs at all. As I've been arguing in a series of articles in The Atlantic recently, the idea of the job, and indeed of labour, no longer makes sense of the forms of livelihood that are currently being pursued or endured depending on your degree of privilege. Moreover, the competitiveness of the job market in particular, insulated bubbles of the economy, perverts our sense of responsibility for redistributing wealth as much as energy for fighting bigger battles that might be more challenging. The athleticism of accomplishment, or what I call the productivity imperative, reflects a situation in which the imagination for labour politics surrenders to the minutiae of personal logistics, the to-do list that is never complete. So by way of apology to Ken, I'm going to offer some material from my forthcoming book, Counterproductive, A Brief History of Time Management, which is late to the publisher. This book is an historical and empirical response to the hegemony of productivity in business thinking and tech design today. My favourite object is Fast Company, so that's what you can see on the screen. Apparently this is Productivity Week on fastcompany.com. So if you want a very brief introduction to my object, go to fastcompany.com and click on this blue box, which is about the hidden secrets of the most productive people. So the book is an account of popular time management techniques, and it revisits the philosophical underpinnings for productivity. The project responds to a growing sense of unease that the social pressures of productivity do not map easily onto a virtuous rationale. As statistics reflect the vast improvements to industrial outputs and efficiencies in Western countries, often at the expense of workers, and as vast inequalities persist between workers within and across countries, we must ask the Marriott. This little card is on the desk of all the hotel rooms. Help us make your stay more productive, is what it says. To what end do we need to be more productive? For our own good or for our managers? Who are our bosses anyway in a world of algorithmic labour? Is being productive our best vision of the good life under capitalism? If so, how did productivity become such an accommodating replacement for being free or being happy? Counterproductive proceeds from the principle that any effort to master time inevitably produces slaves. From the earliest instances of time management in the workplace to the software packages governing labour today, productivity thinking distances workers from each other by apportioning priorities for action. This process reorders the social towards ends that are conducive for capital, and it does this in the guise of appropriate professional conduct. Productivity creates a common sense rationale for assessing the value of interpersonal communication relative to the benefits of more rewarding tasks. It advances the objective of the firm by encouraging competitiveness between workers and restricting the collective mindset that remains the vital source of strength for organised labour. This is where I think Natasha and I have some overlaps, because the ways in which management technologies and design technologies restrict the vision of the individual is really crucial in this task. I'm going to show you a little bit of that history while I can this afternoon. So technology can mean, in this sense, both techniques like skills and pedagogies we learn to become professional, and the infrastructure, the techniques that enable the practice of productivity. Technology allows workers to create a system for tasks that is itself predictable, even if the tasks populating the system may not be. So if you've ever heard of the productivity tool Evernote, some of you might use it. I'm trying to use it, but their premium upgrade package is sold with this slogan: Evernote keeps your progress predictable even when the workday isn't. This is a small belief system of philosophy for a post-secular work life. And it enshrines a kind of control for a sovereign individual, as if there are no colleagues or collaborators that matter. What I'm trying to do in the productivity project is learn from designed objects like software services and hardware to understand the motivations and desires of users, what in the tech world we call user pain points. Pain points. So that is a really great thing to think about at an AFET conference. And by looking at these objects, how can we reverse engineer a labour politics? Another part of this project is to look at the history of management thought, media and technology, and find out why women have been written out of that history. A lot of people, when they think about time management in the workplace, start with Frederick Taylor. And at the same time that Frederick Taylor was using stopwatches on work sites, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, a married couple who you may know from Cheaper by the Dozen, were working with Taylor as acolytes and also competitors in the growing race for the consultancy and engineering and human factors engineering business in corporate America. And this stereochronocyclograph is one of their technological innovations. The Gilbreths tried to use film and images as a more accurate and permanent record than the timekeeping devices of what they called Taylor's stopwatch men. They thought that stopwatches were going against the interests of workers when workers were being timed for tasks, that they had too much human error and that the bosses holding the watches had too much control. So they tried to design technologies that would create more agency for the worker, because the worker could point to the record of their work through these records, through these different inventions. So this stereocyclograph, which I have found in one article, if anyone's interested in following it up, it's an apparatus that involved applying tiny light bulbs to the hands of workers to photograph the smallest of motions. Capturing these micro movements for subsequent assessment generates a trace of labour otherwise lost. And however accurate these representations may have been, their performative effect was to not only empower the worker, but to turn film into a landscape of data, or data, as I've had to learn to say at Intel. a landscape ripe for survey and inspection. These examples each point to the capabilities of media technologies to bring about enlightened insight. This is a big part of what productivity apps do today. So the Gilbreths were famous for reforming the motions and tasks of particular kinds of workers, everyone from, fruit packers to typists. And this wonderful YouTube video, which I encourage you to look at if you're online, it's very mesmerising watching this typist being reformed. I have an article analysing this and the importance of cinema as a media form that's becoming mainstream at the same time that these technologies are being used to train workers is really important, because the performance of productivity for a witnessing eye, for someone learning to become an audience member for film, coincides with this moment in which both workers and, in fact, actors are using the same language, wanting to have their performances recorded for posterity. In the sense that this is how the Gilbreths sold this kind of reform to managers. The more that the individual gets a chance to star in the performance, the more that they can point to the specific contribution they have made to the output of the team. And this, I argue in the book, is the moment in which the individual's exertion and performance is encouraged to move further and further away from a collective vision of productivity. So cinema, it's a much longer story, and I'm glad Patricia pointed to this earlier today, that media technologies are really important to how we understand affect. But the cinematic apparatus transformed the worker's conception of a job away from a gang to a personal achievement. The worker became a particular kind of actor who, through the same sort of forms of pedagogy and training of the eye that we saw also discussed in early cinema studies of Hollywood narrative, the manager's view of a world waiting to be optimised became more common and more thinkable as a result of these technological innovations. Lillian Gilbreth actually was the only one of this generation to have a PhD in industrial engineering, and she's one of the first women to be inducted into the American Academy of Engineering. There's a wonderful story about Lillian that I won't go into today, but she is the one that described the contribution of the worker as like an athlete. And I'm going to focus on athleticism a bit more in the rest of my talk. But becoming a champion, in the words of the film, is a victory that the worker can learn to desire and possess. This is today's keyboard, the updated typist. These are some of the productivity tools that I look at later in the book, which also use similar forms of visualization to show speed. I don't know if anyone's using SwiftKey, but it has exactly the same moments of tracing the finger and the light across the keyboard to perform the aesthetics of activity and productivity. But these are the things I really wanted to show today because I'm really obsessed with them. These are some of the first time management self-help books that came out in the 1970s. One of the arguments I make in this work is that the management of affect and the new forms of training required for subjective bearing in the professional workplace have a direct relationship to economic crisis. And in the 1970s, when we have the first major layoffs in corporate firms and a new kind of awareness of one's dispensability, comes this set of wonderful genres of both self-management and time management. So how to get control of your time and your life. It's just such an awesome title. It is one of the kind of texts, even though the time trap, how to get more done in less time, comes a little bit earlier in 1970. These are the kinds of books that first started creating the quips and the maxims for productivity that we see rehearsed again and again and again every decade. Time management is a genre which has an ironic amnesia. Like it just keeps forgetting its own rules, and then you have these waves and waves of updated editions of these classics, which are actually very helpful if you do struggle with time management. So Lacan, in How to Get Control of Your Time and Your Life, his classic line is, "What is the best use of my time right now?" And one of his maxims is, drift, drown, or decide. This is like how you deal with a piece of information that comes across your desk. You have to operationalize the right schematic, and this is a very specific form of popular systems thinking where if you process the information coming across your desk appropriately on receipt, then it's not inefficient and you have appropriately done what you should. But the other thing that comes up in these texts is an interesting relation to the social and the collegial. So one of the things that they do, as I mentioned in opening, is they retrain your immediate response to another person. An example is, and this really resonates to me now that I work in a cube farm, when a coworker comes up to you and says, "Do you have a minute? Do you have a minute?" And one of the purposes of this self-help is to get you to say politely, no. Because whenever somebody asks you that, as Lacan says, what they really mean is, "May I have your attention now to talk about something that will have an unspecified length of time?" And he has all of these tricks, like, and these are straight from the book. "You might tie up your telephone line a half hour a day by dialing your own number and leaving the phone off the hook, so anyone calling you will get a busy signal." Edwin Bliss, the one in the middle, Getting Things Done, the original Getting Things Done, is my favourite. He's got the line, "Of all the time-saving techniques ever developed, perhaps the most effective is the frequent use of the word no." And one of the things these books do routinely, it's a very obvious genre and form, is to make sure that you retrain yourself to always identify your life goals. So as we move into the 1990s, these books start to come up with their own, catchphrases, and Marshall Cook's Time Management diagnoses the problem as speed sickness. One of the classic strategies that the books ask you to do is to sit for what you imagine is 2 minutes, doing nothing, just to see how accurately you even can sense time when you're feeling hurried. A lot of them call this motion sickness, adrenaline addiction, the psychosocial and pseudoscientific aspects of these books are really fascinating and actually predate a lot of the pseudoscience that is now attached to what has been called at this conference mindfulness movement. And then we also have this later wave of publishers that focus this time management self-help specifically at women. So I really love Laura Stack, the Productivity Pro. And I've been told that I should work on this kind of profile pic for my book, Ken. So we might need a bit more hairspray. So I won't be able to say much more about this, but there is a really interesting way in which these texts anticipate the kind of zeitgeisty, overwhelmed NPR-style angst that Americans will know well about high-performing professionals trying to balance, their actual desire to work with the other intimacies that socially they are sanctioned to enjoy. I wanted to focus just a little bit on the figure on the left, who some of you may recognise as Dave Allen. So when his book Getting Things Done came out, this was the book that really got taken up in Silicon Valley, to the extent that any book is taken up in Silicon Valley. This is the kind of unspoken truth of Silicon Valley. Books tend not to be read by engineers, certainly not by the managers of engineers, as I am now finding. What Dave Allen did, which is really interesting in relation to Lillian Gilbreth's idea of athleticism and creating an individual worker who wants to strive to be better, is he actually adopts this kind of language, managing your workflow as a form of elegance and a form of aesthetic performance that can be bettered. And like others of the male persuasion in this genre, they often talk about athleticism in terms of muscle tone and the way that you're exercising of your system. So for Dave Allen, it's all about adopting a system and letting the system take care of your anxieties and all of your worries. You can trust in the system to file all the information appropriately, to be reliable. This shift is a way of, I think, normalising an approach to work that does really focus on the individual pursuit, and the competitive of the workforce then becomes a difficulty that any labour politics is going to have trouble overcoming. The heroic individual who is the star of the performance that can be mastered and rewarded is convenient for workplaces that do not want to adequately reward all of their workers. And the thing that's interesting about the way that Dave Allen frames this as athleticism corresponds with one of the philosophers that I've been using in this work, Peter Sloterdijk, who actually talks about athleticism and the persuasive acts that the practicing subject has often been encouraged to engage in as a way of showing their subjectivity against the flow or the tide or the river of life that will be distracting you from this more pure and practiced subjectivity. One of the things that's really challenging for me now that I'm writing this work in a tech environment is noticing the ways in which the idea of flow or getting in the zone or training oneself to be an athlete works in tandem with the ways that IT understands productivity. So not only are management discourses normalising the idea of productivity for good, but the way that we understand a good design is maximising the user experience for the flow state. And I think there are explicit overlaps with Natasha's idea of the machine zone here. So the intersection of common sense productivity principles in management theory and IT is something I think is very tied up in the experience economy. Everything now is being understood in terms of an experience that can be enhanced and maximised. So this is The Road to Flow mapped against The Road to Burnout by Forrester Research. And it also has, it's probably difficult to read, but a lot of those tips that I was pointing out in the time management manuals are reappearing in some of these scientific research consultancy reports that are now informing large technology companies in how they design. So just to wrap this up, I have a couple of concerns, I suppose, in thinking through the practice of productivity post-recession when we are being encouraged to be productive for dubious rewards. One of the things I think that's obvious to me in a very well-rewarded workplace is that athleticism encourages a form of performance that is inevitably unequal, even within the same workplace, but also by consecrating the battle for rewards within particular atmospheres. And so a lot of what I've been writing lately has been trying to move us from the idea of the competitive career, where an individual follows a linear path, to a finish line, as if we could even talk about that after the recession, to atmospheres and environments where we can actually think more about a collective sense of security and how we are contributing to it, and not withdrawing from the social in order to be ethical professionals. So Sloterdijk talks about immunology, and my reading of productivity tools is that they, much like our devices in general have become immunological devices for contemporary capitalism. I'm now studying airplanes and airline travel, and the addiction to devices that airlines are now feeding also meets with this kind of perspective. But I believe with Sloterdijk that individual immunity is only possible in common, and that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.